Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and today, I know I say this every week, but I am super excited, and I'm even more excited because, guys, this is my 10th episode. I know you're as excited as I am to explore this 10th episode, but in honor of it being my 10th episode, we're going to be doing things a little different today. It's going to be exciting. Well, it's exciting for me. Hopefully it's exciting for you, but it's going to be interesting because the person we're talking about today, I will get into in a second, but it's going to be a good one. Before we get into it, make sure you're liking, subscribing so you get notifications every time we post a new episode, which is every Wednesday. But make sure you tell your friends about it. If you like these creepy things and you know other people that like these creepy things, be sure to share it because we want to spread the creepiness, right? Anyways, today we are talking about someone everybody knows. I was going to say everybody loves. Not everybody loves this person. Most people don't love this person. Everybody is aware of this person. They are the most famous murderer of all time. Today, we are talking about the infamous Jack the Ripper. And for all of you listeners in the UK, feel free to correct me if I say anything wrong, because I'm sure you probably know more about this. But, guys, we have to do things differently today because we don't know who Jack the Ripper is. I can't give you his background. I can't give you information about how he grew up or what might have drawn him in to do these things. Although, based off of everybody we've talked about so far, we can guess that he probably came from a family with an overly zealous religious mother and a drunk father. Just saying. We could probably make that guess. But today, because we don't know the details about this person, we don't even know his name, we are going to first just talk about the murders. We're going to talk about the scenes. We're going to talk about all of that. And then we will go into some theories. And I'll tell you the theory that I like the most of who I think it is. It could be wrong. Like I said, we don't really know who it is. But we're going to get into that. And just so you know, there are some pictures out there of the murder victims and some of the murders. They will give you nightmares. If you are the kind of person that likes looking that kind of stuff up, great, go for it. I mean, I'm that person, hence the podcast. But viewer discretion if you are going to look those up. But today, we're going to get into it. Jack the Ripper. Let's go, guys. So Jack the Ripper, he actually wasn't originally known as Jack the Ripper. They were the Whitechapel murders. That is what they were known for originally, before eventually he would give himself the moniker of Jack the Ripper. But we're going to get into that a little later. First thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into the victims. And I'm going to tell you right now, you guys are going to see a trend with these ladies. And there's no judgment here. All of them have backgrounds that led them to these lifestyles. I'm just going to say there is a trend with every single one of them. So the first victim of Jack the Ripper was Martha Tabram, also known as Martha Turner to a lot of people in the area. And they believe she is for sure the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Obviously, they didn't know that this was going to be a serial killer on the loose at the time. They just thought this was a one-off woman who got killed by one of her customers. So they didn't know for sure. But This victim was murdered on August 7th in 1888. Martha had actually been married and had 2 children, but eventually her excessive drinking would cause her marriage to crumble before her eyes. So without the income of her husband, she had to turn to other means to get money, which was pretty common for women at the time. I wrote a whole thesis about this in my graduate program about how financial freedom actually helped women be more free in life because they were very dependent on men at this time in history. So with her marriage crumbling, she would leave her husband, leave her children behind, and she would end up living with a man named William Turner. And they lived together on and off for a few years and actually stopped living together 3 weeks before her death. So she would often try and sell different knickknacks and things to try and earn money, but it didn't fully pay the rent. It didn't fully pay for food, or more importantly, it didn't pay for her alcohol. So she would actually turn to prostitution to supplement that income. And the night of her murder, her and her friend had actually gone out drinking because, I don't know if I've mentioned this, she really, really liked her alcohol. So they went out drinking, and Martha was seen leaving the tavern around 11-ish with a soldier, and they were going into a dark alleyway. She knew of this very specific area where she could provide her services to the gentleman and not be disturbed. And so she left around 11 with this man, and they actually don't believe the soldier was the person who killed her. They don't know for sure, but it's pretty likely it wasn't him because she was seen with other men a little later. But at 1:40 a.m., a woman actually passed where Martha's body would eventually be found, but she saw nothing there. There was no body, there was no person. And then at 3:30 a.m., a 25-year-old man saw a body slumped on the stairs leading into the George Yard building, but he really didn't think anything of it because a lot of people would actually end up sleeping in that stairwell. So he just assumed it was a vagrant just sleeping for the night. But about an hour later, so at 4:45 a.m., a man was actually leaving for work when he saw the same body, but noticed an important detail. There was a large pool of blood around her, and he freaked out and ran to find a police officer to help with this individual. And she had actually ended up being stabbed 39 times all over her body. And this would be the first in many, many, many murders that Jack the Ripper would commit. By many murders, there's five of them. That's still a lot, and they're very gruesome, all right? So Mary Ann Nichols is the second victim of Jack the Ripper. So the first murder happened on August 7th. The next murder would happen August 31st, 1888. So Mary Ann Nichols was also known as Polly around the Whitechapel district. Polly Nichols, she was 43 years old, had been married for about 15 years before this point. She had 5 children. And again, she really loved the booze, and the drinking started to get really out of control, and her husband just couldn't handle it anymore and ended up leaving her and divorcing her. And she had actually left her husband 5 or 6 times before they were divorced. So it was kind of to be expected. She had left and come back and left and come back. So her lack of financial control also contributed to this because she couldn't keep track of money, and any money she got, she spent on alcohol. And so after the divorce, her financial incompetence and her alcoholism, it just spiraled out of control. And she would work in workhouses and eventually became a lady of the night, selling herself to gentlemen to supplement that income so she can get more alcohol. And she was widely known as an alcoholic, and she ironically would sell her services for 3 pence, which is the exact same price it would have cost to buy a tall glass of gin, versus charging her clients 4 pence, which would be the price of a bed for the night. So you can tell where her priorities kind of lay. She really wanted that alcohol because she only charged enough that she could get more alcohol instead of actually looking for a place to stay at night. On the night of her murder, her friend Ellen had actually tried to convince her to come home with Ellen that night, but Polly absolutely refused. She was like, I'm going to be fine, and you know what? I actually want to earn a little bit more money, so this is going to be fine. I'll be fine. So Ellen, her friend, kind of gave up and let her go on her way. Well, her body was discovered by police officer Constable Neal on August 31st at 3:40 a.m. And I am actually going to get into more specific details about her murder and the circumstances that surrounded her murder a little bit later in my theory of whodunit, but her throat had actually been cut all the way to her spine. So she basically had been decapitated and was only had her head still attached with the spine. And she had multiple stab wounds all over her body that had actually been hidden by her dress, which again comes to play in, it's not even my theory, the theory I liked best. So that was Polly. Next, the next victim was Annie Chapman. She was 47 years old, and she was found September 8th. So not very long after the second victim of Jack the Ripper. So he's starting to pick up the pace of his murders. So she had been living in a lodging house for the last few years on Dorset Street, where she actually paid 8 pence a night for a double bed. So she shared a bed with someone else, and she'd been living there for quite a few years. And here's the trend, guys. She also was a big fan of alcohol. And all of these ladies, by today's standards, would be for sure classified as alcoholics. Annie definitely fit into that category. And I thought this was super cute. She sold crocheted flowers for her income. So she would crochet little flowers and then sell them. But that didn't make a lot of money for her. So she would supplement that with prostitution like the other ladies. And Annie was actually, when she was killed, she was in the backyard of the lodging house. So she was just right outside of her door. And she was found the next morning with her head actually propped up against the stairs leading into the lodging house. And just like the other ladies before her, her throat had been slit as well. And it actually took the police so long to get to the scene of the crime that a whole crowd had started to gather and look at Annie's bloodied body. And there had been parts removed from her, and they eventually found unused sacks to cover her body so the crowd would disperse and stop looking at it. How horrendous is that? People are just gawking at a mutilated body of a woman. This is a human being. It's just, I guess they didn't have a ton of entertainment back then or something. I don't know. But after the medical examiner had actually examined her body for wounds and what had killed her, they found that the killer had actually removed her womb and taken it with him. So he had kept a memento for the first time in his murdering rampages. That just gives me the heebie-jeebies. I tell you what, guys, I don't know what it is about these murders, but these ones have given me nightmares, and I think it's because we don't know who this creeper is. So, anyways, Jack the Ripper had removed her womb and kept it for a souvenir. Now, the next murders took place on September 30th, and that's right, murders. He actually killed 2 ladies in one night for the next round. So Elizabeth Stride, or Long Liz, as she was known, she was 44, was the first victim of the night. She had actually spent her last day alive cleaning the lodging house where she had been staying for the last couple of years. She had originally been a domestic servant in Sweden and then traveled to London where she would become a registered prostitute. So she was also a lady of the evening, and she also loved the alcohol. She would earn 6 pence for her week, like for her work week, and immediately go straight to the pub and drink it away. She loved to drink. And at 7 p.m. the night that she was murdered, they had actually seen her come home to the lodging house, and she, quote unquote, got ready for the evening and was gone again by 7:30 p.m. She also worked as a prostitute for the extra income. So she was making an okay living by cleaning the lodging house. But again, she really liked her alcohol and needed that extra money. So at 12:35 a.m., a police officer actually saw Elizabeth alive with a young man, and they were kissing on each other and flirting and like being super cuddly. And so the police officer found nothing suspicious with this and continued on his way. Well, at 12:24 a.m., Israel Schwartz of 22 Helen Street in Backchurch Lane stated that at this hour, he saw turning into Burner Street from Commercial Road and have gotten as far as the gateway where the murder was committed. So he turned onto the street where they would find Elizabeth's body, and he actually saw her with some gentlemen, and he saw a man that had stopped to speak to a woman who was standing in the gateway, and the man was trying to pull the woman into the street, but he actually ended up throwing her to the ground. And the woman screamed 3 times, but it wasn't very loud. It was just more of like what you would make a sound if you were like being thrown to the ground, not like a bloody cry of being murdered. So he actually saw this altercation happen with her and decided to cross the street because he saw a second man lighting his pipe kind of close by. And the man who threw her down on the ground actually called out to the man on the opposite side of the road. And so Schwartz freaked out and started walking away because he felt like he was being followed by this second man. And so he ran as far as he could to get away. But the man actually didn't follow him. So Israel Schwartz saw Elizabeth Stride with this man, and he was being very abusive to her, but ran away. And the police actually ended up clearing the second man, who actually had no connection at all to the crime. He had just been there. And Israel Schwartz is the closest thing they actually have to an eyewitness of who the murderer might have actually been, because he was the last person to see her alive and saw her with a very aggressive man. So at 1 a.m., I'm going to butcher Lewis's last name, but Louis Dimschultz, I don't know how to say it. Sorry, guys. We know that I am not good at pronouncing names. Was actually trying to drive his cart into the yard, and the horse would not go into the gate. It absolutely refused to go into the gate. So he hopped off the cart to investigate what was going on because the horse was being so skittish. and he found Elizabeth's body. And he found it so recent to the actual murder that her body was actually still warm. So they believe that her murderer was scared off and wasn't actually able to finish what he was trying to do. He did slit her throat like all the other ladies, but that's as far as he was able to make it. So, because they believe the murderer was frustrated that he didn't get to, finish what he was wanting and get, that high of to destroying someone else's body, he actually found a second victim that night. Her name was Catherine, or Kate Eddowes. Her parents had actually died when she was young, and she had been married with 3 children. But after her separation from her husband, she actually ended up living with another man until the night that she was killed. On September 28th, she had spent the night at the casual ward of Shoe Lane Workhouse, where it was reported by several newspapers that she had actually told the superintendent that she had come back to earn the reward being offered for the apprehension of the Whitechapel murderer, as she believed she knew who it was. And the superintendent actually told her that she needed to be careful because he didn't want her to get murdered, and that if she wasn't careful, she would end up being murdered by this murderer. And her response is, and I quote, "Oh, no fear of that." Yeah, that was on September 8th, or September 28th, and she was murdered on the 30th of September. Oh, that's just so sad to me that she was just like, "Oh no, I'll be fine. Don't worry about it." And then just 2 days later, they end up finding her as one of the victims. Now, it's believed that Catherine wasn't actually a prostitute. They don't have really good evidence that she was one. Some of the sources that I read said she was a prostitute. Some of them said she was not a prostitute. We're not really sure for sure if she was or not, but of course she really, really, really loved alcohol and loved to drink and get drunk. So on the night of the murder, September 30th, she had actually, this is so crazy to me, she had been released from jail just before, just earlier in the evening, because she had been arrested for being drunk in public. If they had held on to her just a little bit longer, Catherine would have lived. She would have survived. She would have never encountered Jack the Ripper. But they had just barely released her, and obviously she went straight to drinking once she got released. So later in the evening, she had been seen with 3 different men, one of which she had been seen with at about 10 minutes before her body was actually discovered. So they have a hunch that it was obviously that guy that had done this to her. But her body was discovered by Constable Edward Watkins around 1:44 a.m. in the darkest corner of Mitre Square. Her throat had been cut all the way back to her spine like all the other ladies. And her stomach, sorry guys, this is when it gets gruesome, so this is your only warning. Her stomach had been cut open with parts of her intestines actually thrown over her shoulders and around her body. Her face had actually been cut with very precise upside down V's in her cheeks, and her uterus and kidneys had both been removed and taken and were gone. And this had all been done in a 10-minute window. It did not take this murderer very long to kill her, which is so mind-blowing because all of these accounts, people have seen these women alive and then it didn't take long and they were gone. Now, Mary Jane Kelly is the last of Jack the Ripper's murders, as far as we know. he probably killed more ladies and we just haven't connected them. But Mary Jane Kelly was by far the most brutal of all the murders. Now, I've talked about how they've been cut open, stabbed, missing body parts. It is nothing compared to what Mary Jane Kelly experienced. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old, and she was found on November 9th. So it actually took him a little bit longer to commit this next murder, because the last one had been committed on September 30th. So November 9th, it's been over a month since he's done anything. Now, Mary Jane Kelly was originally from Ireland. She had been married at the age of 16 when her family moved to Wales. And her husband was actually killed in a mining explosion. And this is ultimately what would lead her into a life of prostitution and drinking. And of course, she really loved the booze. Like, these ladies all really, really enjoyed their alcohol. And I can't say it enough because it's just true. That's how it was. The night of the murder, Mary had actually been seen very drunk at 11:45. She was seen going into her room with a, quote, blotch-faced round man who was about 5'5". He had a little mustache, and she could be heard singing for a very long time from her room. So her and this blotch-faced man went into a room, and she was just singing at the top of her lungs. And even one of her neighbors wanted to go tell her to be quiet, because this is pretty late at night. And her husband just said, leave the poor girl alone. Just let her be. So she kept singing for quite a while. And then she was seen again at 2 a.m. asking friends for money. And when the friends said that they didn't have any money to give her, Mary just kind of walked away and was like, fine, whatever, I'll figure it out. I'm heading out. Well, soon someone saw a well-dressed man approach Mary, and they would walk away laughing together. Now, Mary's friend kind of followed them a little bit to see where they were going, and they ended up heading towards Mary's house and where she was staying, and he saw them go inside. After about 45 minutes, this friend decided, no one's coming out, no one's leaving, she's okay, I can leave. So her friend went home. Well, the next morning at 11:45 a.m., Mary's landlord came knocking to collect Mary's late rent. Because, she's spending all her money on alcohol, doesn't really have money to pay rent. So I just imagine this man angrily pounding on the door, being like, Mary, I know you're in there. Open the door. And when he didn't receive a response, he decided to go around to the window and try and get her to open the door from there. Because, I'm sure if you're behind on rent, you don't want to respond to the landlord banging on your door. So he went around to the window and noticed a broken pane of glass. So he actually reached in and moved the curtain that was blocking his way to see into Mary's room. And that's when he saw Mary's mutilated body. Now, I'm going to read you what the medical examiner's report actually described the scene to be. It's kind of graphic. Again, this is your only warning. We are talking about a serial killer that mutilated people's bodies. So there's your warning. So this is what the medical examiner said. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts. The uterus and kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and the thighs were on a table. The pericardium said that right. That is actually correct. Pericardium was open below and the heart absent. So the murderer took her heart this time. On top of literally just filleting her. Like, again, there are pictures of this murder. I don't recommend that you look at it. It's pretty horrific. And this is the only murder that would actually have pictures of the scene. So if you really want to see it, I don't recommend it. There are photos of this murder scene. But there are, like I mentioned before, photos of all the victims, like their post-mortem photos in the mortuary. They took their pictures. If you want to see those, I don't know why. They're terrible. Anyways, so this was the first, like, Jack the Ripper had mutilated the other bodies before, but this was by far the worst he had ever done. And like I mentioned, originally these murders were called the Whitechapel murders because they all took place in the Whitechapel district. The name of Jack the Ripper actually didn't appear until the murderer himself told the police that was his name. He adopted the moniker in a letter that he wrote to police. And don't worry, this letter that he sent to the police was actually written in blood. And he would also send the police with some other letters that he would write, body parts, like pieces of liver and those kinds of things from his victims. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, why don't we just use those letters to get some DNA evidence? Let's take a look. We can figure it out with technology now. Not so fast, buckaroo. All of those original letters, gone. We only have copies. We don't have the original blood letters from Jack the Ripper. But the very first letter that he actually wrote to the police is called the Dear Boss letter. And the letter said, I'm going to read it to you. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squill. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear from me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. He said ha ha in his letter. Oh my gosh. The next job I do shall clip the lady's ears off and send the police officers just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work. Then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And yes, he did remove the ears from one of his victims. So that is how they knew for sure that this was the murderer, because he would detail things that Jack the Ripper would do. And this is where they would adopt the moniker for Jack the Ripper. He gave it to himself because he was ripping the ladies. So there have been a ton of theories, a lot of copycats, hoaxes, all kinds of things when it surrounds Jack the Ripper. And no one actually knows for sure who he is. And we don't have a really good way to know for sure who he is. And there are quite a few suspects for Jack the Ripper. There's a couple: Montague Druitt, Duke of Clarence, which they pretty much cleared, Sir William Gull, Francis Tumblett, and even, like I mentioned in H.H. Holmes, some people have theories that it's actually H.H. Holmes. the more I learn about these killings, though, I don't necessarily think that it was H.H. Holmes. And it's interesting to hear some different accounts of what the victims were like. Like, some people believe that it was someone with medical experience who was very precise and very well versed in the body and anatomy, and even would use a scalpel in his murders, and the cuts were very clean. But then I've also read other reports where the cuts were very jagged, and it seemed like this individual didn't really know what they were doing and just were picking parts that they thought were good to take. Like, so there's no clear and concise, like, this is exactly what we're looking for. The main things that they are looking for in the suspect of Jack the Ripper are these few things. First, he blends in well with the general population. So he's just a Joe Schmo. He just fits in with everybody else. The second thing, he's very unremarkable, but he's a local man. So doesn't stand out in a crowd, blends in, but is local. He knows the area really well. He knows where to go. He knows where to find things. It's like he's been there his whole life, basically. Number 3, he needs a reason to be out on the streets at that time of day. It was interesting reading all of these accounts. The number of people that I feel like were outside at like 3 a.m., 4 a.m., like even like 2 a.m. A lot of people apparently left for work at like 4 a.m., which makes sense because they actually had to walk there. They didn't have cars, so they'd have like a 45-minute walk or whatever. So people had to be up super early, and there was a lot of people out on the streets at that time. So whoever Jack the Ripper is would have had to have a reason to actually be on the streets of that time, so he wouldn't raise suspicion. The next thing on the list is he had to have had a troubled background. Like I said, he's got to have that overly zealous mother, drunk father, abusive background, very troubled background. Because we've noticed that trend in all of the crazy people we've talked about on this channel. Like, they all pretty much have crazy backgrounds. There's very few of them that don't have an abusive background. So, number 5, this is something that he fantasized about. This is something that had been on his mind for a while and had been building up, which would mean he would have to be in his mid to late 30s, early 40s. So that's kind of the age range they were looking for, because that fits someone who has had this urge building up inside of him and finally just can't take it anymore and has to let it out. So those are the main qualities that they're looking for in these suspects for Jack the Ripper. Now, back in 2014, there were actually claims made that there was DNA evidence found that finally identified who Jack the Ripper was. And they claimed it was a Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski. But there has been a lot of pushback on this because the DNA that they found was actually on a scarf that supposedly belonged to Catherine Eddowes, and it was supposedly found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. And there's no proof that that actually happened. Like, there's no proof that this scarf actually came from the murder scene. There's no way to prove that. And it has been so long since that murder happened, it could have easily been contaminated between when it was tested and when the murder took place. It had passed through many, many hands. It wasn't kept secluded and safe, and it wasn't tested immediately after the murder. So it would definitely have been exposed to other people's DNA since that time. And the DNA test that they actually performed was only something that could see if the DNA was a relative of someone. It couldn't, or it could say it couldn't say definitively who it was. It just could say if it was slightly related to another DNA. So the children and grandchildren, I guess it would be like great-grandchildren of Catherine Eddowes and of Aaron Kaminsky, they had to donate their DNA to have this test happen. And the DNA test could only say if they were or were not related. It couldn't say for sure if it was actually those people. So there's been a lot of pushback on those findings because there's no real solid proof. Now, we're going to dive into what I think happened or who I think it is. And this isn't my theory. I actually watched a documentary from the Smithsonian Channel. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it. Krister Holmgren is a journalist who has actually been studying this case for 30 years and really going into the eyewitness accounts, the police statements, everything. He's just been doing a deep dive. And listening to this theory, I'm convinced that this is Jack the Ripper only because of how many true crime episodes I've watched. All the evidence always points back to people that are in this situation. So after my lengthy experience with true crime, I'm going to say he is probably the suspect. So let's get into this. This is the theory of Krister Holmgren as to who the murderer is and who Jack the Ripper really is. So we need to go back to Polly Nichols' murder. It took place on a street called Bucks Row on August 31st, 1888, between 3:15 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. Now, Bucks Row is a very long, narrow street surrounded by tall buildings with no real entrances and exits except for the entrance of the street and the exit of the street. There's no like side streets or alleyways for people to hide in. It's just a straight shot. So you either go in a building or you go down the street, period. Now, 15 minutes before Polly Nichols would be killed, a policeman had actually walked past the area and all was quiet. And the way the police patrolled at that time, every 30 minutes, a police officer would pass the entrance of Bucks Row and then the exit of Bucks Row. So there was always policemen passing by the entrance and exit of the street, along with a police officer that would actually go around the block and come and check in the actual street. In addition to that, there were actually watchmen everywhere within earshot of the street. So it almost seems impossible that the murderer would have been able to get away and escape unseen. So they think whoever murdered Polly actually was there around the same time as the police, but they didn't catch him because he, again, blends in with the crowd. So Police Constable Neal discovered Polly's body at 3:45 a.m., but he was not the first person to discover Polly's body. A man named Robert Paul claimed that he had been the one to find Polly's body before Constable Neal, but he did not find Polly's body alone. When he was walking up, he saw a man crouching next to her. And when Robert came closer, the man, stood up over the body and was looking down at the body. And Robert said that it was dark and I was hurrying along when I saw a man standing where the woman was. He came a little towards me, but as I knew the dangerous character, I tried to give him a wide berth. So he was a little sketched out by this man that was over Polly's body. But eventually he noticed that Polly was laying there. So he went closer to investigate to see if she was okay. Now, the man that was standing over Polly's body gave the name Charles Alan Cross. So when Robert got close enough, he and Charles Cross tried to check on Polly. Like, he bent down and was looking really close at her body to see if he could see any breaths coming in and out. And when he couldn't tell what was actually wrong, Robert decided he wanted to go find a police officer so they could get some help. And he knew that the police officers would be pretty close by. Charles decided that he would accompany Robert. He didn't want to stay there with Polly, which was a little odd because if you think this person's in distress, wouldn't you want to stay with them and see if you could help them? You would think, but he decides to go along with Robert. So both Robert Hall and Alan Cross, they actually supposedly shared the same exact walking route to work. But both claimed that they had seen no one else on the road. But this is, like I said, it's one entrance, one exit. You would see people walking in front of you. You would hear people walking in front of you, even if they were a far distance away. It's that kind of street where it's very obvious if there is anyone else on the street. And Robert never saw Alan Cross walking in front of him. He just came upon him when they found Polly's body. And Charles claimed that he didn't hear or notice Robert until he was like right next to him, which is also strange because of the type of the shoe that they wore back in the day. They were pretty hefty and made some good, clippity-clop sounds. So you knew when people were coming up on you. But he claimed he didn't hear him, didn't see him. No one saw anything, which is super suspicious because they supposedly would have been walking basically next to each other based off of the timeline that was given. So I want to point that out because it's a little suspicious. So if they had actually seen each other before, like, they would have stumbled upon the body about the same time. Okay, so a police officer had actually seen Alan Cross leaving Buck Street just before the woman's body was discovered. Policeman George Mizzen said that Robert Paul and Alan Cross had found the police officers together. Charles Cross was the first to speak to the officer and stated that there was a woman lying down in Buck's Row on the road, or on the broad of her back. I think she's dead or drunk, but I believe she's dead. Which Robert wasn't thinking that she was dead. He was thinking that she was just unconscious or drunk, passed out drunk. And he gave the police officer his address and his name as Charles Alan Cross, and his address was 22 Dovington Street in Whitechapel. But when they investigated further, no one by that name lived in that address. So he's giving the police a wrong address. And we'll find out a little later that he also gave them the wrong name. Now, Alan Cross also stated to a bystander, a policeman wants you. There's a woman lying there. There's a police officer with her, so he wants you to go and help her. And then when the witness came to the scene of the crime, Officer Neal was there. Now, remember, when Robert and Charles left her body, there was no police officer there. She was there alone. She was laying there alone. And Officer Neal only found her body right after they had left her body. So they had no idea that there was a police officer with him. So Alan Cross had made that up. And luckily for him, he wasn't put under scrutiny because there just happened to be a police officer there. But he knew there was no police officer there because him and Robert had left the body alone. So lots of lying going on by this Alan Cross character. Now, between the time Mizzen would let Alan Cross go and the time he made it to the body, Constable Neal had found the body. So Mizzen believed Alan Cross's story that they had left her with a police officer. And so when he got there and saw the Constable Neil was already with the body, he just assumed, like the bystander, like, oh, he was telling the truth. This is accurate. Well, when they started doing a little more investigating, they needed him to come back and make a statement again. Well, he didn't voluntarily go back to the station. After publishing information in the newspaper, Alan Cross finally caved and went back to the police station to make a statement after a few days. And he also, because he needed to identify the body and say, yeah, that's who I saw, he gave the coroner a false name, and it made him even look more suspicious than he had before. It turns out Charles Allen Cross was Charles Allen Lechmere. And that was who lived at the address. Charles Allen Cross was actually Lechmere's stepdad's last name. So he had lied to the police officer and gave them his stepdad's last name. And his story was all mixed up. Now, Alan Lechmere said he left for work at 3:30 a.m. And after coming to the body, he was joined moments later by Robert Paul. This would have meant that he arrived at the murder scene at 3:37. Robert Paul left his home at 3:45. This gave Alan Lechmere 10 whole minutes alone with the body. Super sketchy. Why is he lying about the time period? And how long has it taken Jack the Ripper to commit his murders? 10 minutes or less, right? So Alan Lechmere would have arrived at 3:37 a.m. And he also claimed that he was late for work, so he would have been aware of the time. So he's lying about when he got there. And if he had actually been walking when he claimed he was walking, like I mentioned before, Robert Paul would have seen him right in front of him. They wouldn't have been walking together, but they would have been really darn close to each other. Because if he arrived at the body moments after Alan did, they would have seen each other. Now, with her injuries, she actually had manual strangulation, and then her neck was severed. So she had 12 injuries total, including stab wounds, and it would have only taken about 2 minutes, 2 whole minutes, for Polly's life to be taken. That's it. And Alan Lechmere had 10 minutes alone. He only needed 2. And the way her body was, it seemed like the murder had actually been interrupted prematurely. Because, again, no organs had been removed, and someone had actually pulled her dress down to try and hide the wounds, to make it look like she was just laying on the ground. So that means the murder was interrupted probably by footsteps of someone walking up to the murder scene. And there wouldn't have actually been a lot of blood. So I know that's probably your question. Well, if he murdered her and stabbed her, wouldn't there be blood? Well, they believe that Polly had actually died before she was stabbed and her neck was slit. And if she was dead before those took place, there would have been, this is going to sound so gross, sorry guys, but there wouldn't have been any blood pressure, so there wouldn't have been blood splatter anywhere. And when Robert saw her body, there was no blood anywhere. He didn't see blood anywhere on her. But by the time Officer Neil got there, there was a pool of blood around her. So that tells me that he got there very recently after she was killed. So it's just really interesting. He wouldn't have been covered in blood because there would have been no blood splatter because there was no blood pressure to make it splatter. It would have just slowly come out. So he would have been, Lechmere would have been completely clean and free of blood if he had murdered her. Now, like I said, he would have been well aware of Robert Paul before he arrived, because he would have for sure heard him coming, which explains the murder being interrupted. And like I said, her body was different. Her injuries had been covered up and hurried. It wasn't like something that he took his time with. It was a hurried job. And Lechmere had actually 12 kids. He was 39 years old, which is in the right age range. He always lived close to his mother. He had a very tight relationship with his mother. But 2 months before the killings actually started, he moved away from his mother. It was almost like they had a little bit of a falling out. And he left his oldest daughter to live with his mother. So he knew the area really well. The route he took to work led him straight through the heart of the majority of the murders that happened. Literally all but 2 of the murders that took place happened on his way to work. And that's either really incredibly bad luck, and he would have seen every single murder that took place because it happened on his route, his time for work, so he would have run into them, or it has to be him, because all but 2 of them were on the route to his work. The 2 that didn't happen on the route to his work were right by his mother's house. One of them was literally around the corner, and he knew that area really, really well because that's where he had grown up. That's the area he had spent most of his time in. And the first murder by his mother's house was just around the corner. The next one was on the same route he would have taken to go to work from his mother's house that he had been taking for 20 years before this point in time. So every single, and I've got the details here, I won't go into them, but every single murder happened around the time he would have been going to work on the same exact walking route to work. So like I said, he's either the most unlucky man and saw every single one of these murders and the bodies, or he did it. Like, it's very circumstantial, but pretty compelling evidence. Like, this person should have been scrutinized. And if this had taken place right now, he would have been a main suspect. And based off of all the evidence, they even asked a prosecutor, like, would this fly in court? Would you be able to actually convict him? And they were like, yeah, based off of the evidence we're finding, you could probably convict this person. So anyways, so every single one of those murders would have happened close to his route. His job, he actually was a delivery man, and he had to be up early because he was a delivery man of meat. So if his clothes ever were bloody or looked messy or disheveled, no one would suspect a thing because he was a deliverer of meat. So of course he would have blood on his clothes because he's dropping off meat. So there's just, oh, guys, you should watch this documentary. It's pretty good. It has me convinced after all the true crime I've watched, this man for sure did it. He for sure did it. The only thing that I have a question, though, is this man lived to be older. He lived well into his, like, I think it was 70s or 80s. But the murders just seemed to stop. But at the end of the documentary, they said that they were looking into more murders to see if they were connected in the areas that he was spending his time. So I would be curious to see if there's a follow-up to that. But because, you know, serial killers don't just stop killing. They tend to escalate and escalate and escalate unless this killer felt like, you know what? I've escalated it to the point where literally I could do nothing else to a human body. I don't know. But they don't just stop. So there's a lot of theories out there, and we don't have time to get into all of them. There's so much, guys. And maybe later I'll do a second episode where we can look into other theories and other potential Jack the Rippers. But he's never been caught. And There's one thing I can say for sure. For absolute sure. Jack the Ripper is dead. I know, it's shocking. It's crazy, but you know what? He's dead. We don't have to worry about him anymore because he's dead. And you know what? Maybe what stopped him was maybe he was in some kind of freak accident and was killed by a runaway horse and buggy. Maybe he drowned in the River Thames. Thames? How do you guys say that? Sorry, my British friends. I am butchering the name of your great river. I've heard great things about it. Not really, but it's fine. Anyways, or what would be even better is if maybe he was murdered himself. What great sweet revenge would that be? We may never know the fate of the real killer, but we can confidently say he is dead as a doornail and facing retribution for everything he did. So, huzzah, Jack the Ripper has inspired thousands of horror stories. He still haunts people even today, like just his stories and the grisly way he killed his victims. His story will live on forever until we can truly find the phantom that is Jack the Ripper. And that is what makes him our horrible human in history today. Now, join me next week. We're going to talk about someone I have never even heard of, and I can guarantee you have never heard of this person either. But we are going to talk about an African cult leader, and I'm going to butcher her name. It's Credonia Mwerondi. I think I will double check. I will make sure I say that right. Credonia Mwerondi. She led the mass murder of over 3,000 people and created a cult and a religious zealots, and it is crazy. I've just read a little bit about her story, but no one knows about her, and it's mind-blowing. I have never heard of her. I'm sure you haven't. So join me next time as we explore this horrible human in history together. It's gonna be a wild ride. So like I said, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, follow me so you get notified anytime there's a new episode. Make sure you're sharing it with all the people that enjoy this kind of stuff. And even if they don't, share it with them anyways, because it's fun to hear these kinds of stories, especially knowing that Jack the Ripper is dead, right? So we will see you guys next week on Horrible Humans in History. Later.